The explosion threw Commander Lyra Kethvar against the bulkhead with enough force to crack her exoskeleton armor. She rolled with the impact, years of combat training keeping her functional despite the ringing in her head and the taste of blood in her mouth. Around her, the abandoned mining station shuddered as its structural supports failed one by one, metal groaning against the vacuum of space that pressed hungrily against breached hull sections. Status report, she called into her comm unit, though she already knew what the response would be. Static. The electromagnetic pulse from the sabotage had fried every piece of communications equipment within a 50-kilometer radius. Standard operating procedure for the human terrorist known as Ghost: isolate your targets, cut their communications, then pick them off one by one. Lyra checked her weapon and surveyed the corridor ahead, noting the way emergency lighting flickered in patterns that suggested imminent power failure. The station was dying around her, just as Ghost had intended. What he probably hadn't intended was to trap himself in the process. For 3 years, she had hunted this phantom. 3 years of chasing rumors and following destruction, always arriving just hours too late to catch more than sensor shadows and the acrid smell of military-grade explosives. Ghost had crippled her fleet at Proxima Station, destroyed the orbital defense platform at Wolf 359, and turned the siege of Kepler 442b into a disaster that had cost the hegemony 12 capital ships and 8,000 lives. But today, finally, she had him cornered. The trap had been perfect: a false intelligence leak about a critical supply depot, a skeleton crew of guards who were actually Lyra's best special operations soldiers, and surveillance equipment disguised as standard mining gear. When Ghost had arrived to sabotage what he thought was a legitimate military target, he'd found himself facing the full might of the hegemony's most elite hunter-killer team. Of course, he'd managed to blow up half the station in the process. Clever, Lyra murmured, noting scorch marks on the walls that indicated improvised explosive devices. But not clever enough. Her armor's sensors indicated that the station's life support would fail completely within the next 47 minutes. The structural collapse would probably kill them both before that became an issue, but it was good to know their timeline. Ghost might be trapped, but he was also armed, dangerous, and fighting for his life. That combination had made him legendary among human resistance cells and a nightmare for hegemony forces. Lyra moved through the damaged corridors with the patience of a predator. Her 4 arms held weapons positioned to cover multiple angles, her enhanced senses scanned for any sign of movement or heat signature, and her tactical display showed the station's layout with overlays indicating the most likely routes her quarry would take. She paused at an intersection, noting blast patterns that suggested Ghost had been forced to detonate his remaining explosives earlier than planned. Good. That meant he was running low on options and ordnance. "I know you can hear me, Ghost," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the station's failing atmosphere. "The station is collapsing. In approximately 40 minutes, we'll both be dead unless we reach one of the escape pods." No response. She hadn't expected one. "There are 3 pods left intact," she continued, moving toward the nearest one. "I'm heading for pod Bay 7. You're welcome to try for one of the others, but I should mention that pods 4 and 12 are in sections that lost structural integrity 12 minutes ago." Still silence, but her motion sensors detected the faintest vibration through the deck plating. Someone was moving, 1 level below her position. Lyra smiled grimly. 3 years of studying this human's tactics had taught her to think like he did. He wouldn't go for the obvious escape route, he'd try to double back, circle around, maybe attempt to ambush her before making his own run for freedom. She continued toward pod Bay 7, but her route took her through sections where she could monitor the approaches to the other escape pods. If Ghost was half as clever as his reputation suggested, he'd realize the tactical situation as clearly as she did. 2 predators, 1 dying station, limited escape options. It was almost poetic. Lyra reached pod Bay 7 and immediately saw the problem. Ghost had been here first. The escape pod was intact, but its launch systems had been systematically destroyed, delicate sabotage that would take hours to repair. Hours they didn't have. Thorough, she admitted to the empty bay. But ultimately pointless. Now neither of us can use this pod. She checked her chrono. 38 minutes until life support failure. Pod Bay 4 was inaccessible due to structural damage. That left Pod Bay 12 as the only viable escape route for either of them. Lyra began moving toward the final pod, her tactical mind automatically calculating approach routes and ambush points. Ghost would be thinking the same thing, planning the same kind of deadly mathematics that had made him so effective against her forces. The difference was that she'd been hunting him specifically for 3 years. She knew his patterns, his preferences, his psychological profile. He was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly committed to his cause, but he was still just one human against the hegemony's best tracker. As she moved through the dying station, Lyra allowed herself to imagine the moment of final confrontation. 3 years of failure, of arriving too late, of watching Ghost's handiwork devastate her forces. 3 years of carrying the scars he'd given her, physical and otherwise, and the weight of every soldier who had died because she couldn't catch one human terrorist. Today, finally, that would end. She reached the approach to Pod Bay 12 and immediately recognized the tactical problem. The bay was at the end of a long corridor with no cover and no alternate routes. Anyone approaching would be completely exposed for the final 30 meters. Classic kill zone configuration. Lyra studied the corridor through her scope, noting blast damage that suggested Ghost had already been here. The escape pod itself was probably intact, he'd need it to survive, but he'd definitely have prepared surprises for anyone trying to reach it. Interesting choice, she said to the empty corridor. Force us both into the same tactical bottleneck and see who's better when everything else is stripped away. She checked her chrono again. 34 minutes. Time to end this. Lyra began her approach toward Pod Bay 12, every sense alert for the ambush she knew was coming. Somewhere in that corridor, Ghost was waiting with whatever weapons and explosives he had left. But she'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years. Let him come. As she stepped into the kill zone, Lyra Cathvar was already bracing for the fight that would determine whether the galaxy's most wanted human terrorist finally paid for his crimes, or whether they'd both die together in the cold vacuum of space. Either outcome would end her hunt. She just had to make sure she was the one who survived to see it. The silence stretched ahead of her, pregnant with violence and the promise of final answers. The first shot came from exactly where Lyra had expected it, an alcove 15 meters down the corridor that provided perfect cover and multiple escape routes. She was already moving when the energy bolt scorched past her head, rolling left and returning fire with 2 of her weapons while the other 2 covered potential flanking positions. Her shots sparked off metal where Ghost had been, but her motion sensors showed he was already relocating. Professional, she admitted, advancing in controlled bounds from cover to cover. But predictable. The second attack came as a series of small explosions, improvised charges that filled the corridor with shrapnel and smoke. Lyra's armor absorbed most of the damage, but she felt the familiar bite of metal fragments finding the gaps in her protection. Fresh scars to add to the collection Ghost had already given her. She pushed through the smoke cloud, knowing that Ghost would be using the visual obstruction to reposition for a better angle. Her enhanced senses cut through the interference, tracking heat signatures and air displacement patterns that revealed nothing. Lyra stopped, every instinct screaming danger. Ghost was gone. Not relocated, not repositioned, gone. Vanished from her sensors as completely as if he'd never been there. Stealth technology, she realized, switching her visual spectrum to infrared and magnetic resonance. Crude but effective. The knife took her in the back, sliding between armor plates with the precision of someone who had studied hegemony equipment specifications in detail. Pain flared through her nervous system as the blade found nerve clusters, and she spun away from the attack, bringing her weapons around to nothing. Again. Ghost was a ghost in truth now, invisible to her sensors and moving with a silence that spoke of years perfecting the art of killing without being seen. Lyra felt blood running down her back, felt the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and fury that had driven her through 3 years of failed hunts. Clever, she called out to the apparently empty corridor. But I've been hunting you long enough to learn your tricks. She triggered her armor's emergency beacon system, not for rescue, since communications were still jammed, but for the electromagnetic pulse it generated. The brief burst of energy would disrupt most stealth systems for several seconds. The pulse revealed Ghost's position for exactly 2 heartbeats, crouched behind a support beam 12 meters to her right, some kind of adaptive camouflage failing under the electromagnetic interference. Lyra put 4 shots into the support beam and was rewarded with the sight of the human diving for new cover. But she'd seen enough in those 2 heartbeats to understand what she was really fighting. Ghost wasn't wearing advanced alien technology or experimental human equipment. His stealth system appeared to be jury-rigged from salvaged components, held together with determination and technical brilliance rather than military engineering. His weapons were standard human infantry gear, modified for increased effectiveness but fundamentally unchanged. He was fighting the hegemony's most elite hunter with improvised equipment and pure skill. Impressive, Lyra said, advancing on his new position. But ultimately insufficient. She triggered another EMP pulse and caught Ghost in the open, sprinting between cover points with the fluid grace of someone who had learned that hesitation meant death. This time she had a clean shot, her targeting systems locked on his center mass, her finger already applying pressure to the trigger. The support beam she damaged earlier chose that moment to fail completely. Lyra threw herself backward as several tons of metal crashed down where she'd been standing, the impact sending vibrations through the deck that triggered sympathetic failures throughout the corridor. Emergency lights failed, atmosphere vented through new cracks in the hull, and the entire section began listing as structural supports reached their breaking point. When the chaos settled, Ghost was gone again. But this time, Lyra could track him. His stealth system had been damaged in the collapse, creating an intermittent signature that her sensors could follow. She pursued him through the dying station, noting how his route seemed designed to avoid the most damaged sections while still moving toward Pod Bay 12. He was being tactical about his retreat. Good. That meant he was still thinking like a soldier rather than a cornered animal. The chase led through what had once been the station's main processing facility, a vast chamber filled with industrial equipment that had been shut down years ago when the mining operation ended. Now it served as a maze of cover and concealment, perfect terrain for a running gun battle between 2 professionals. Lyra entered the chamber with her weapons ready, sweeping for targets while her sensors tracked Ghost's intermittent signature. He was somewhere in the mechanical forest ahead of her, probably setting up another ambush. 31 minutes, she called out, her voice echoing off metal surfaces. We're running out of time to kill each other. Then maybe we should stop trying, came a voice from somewhere in the machinery. Lyra froze. In 3 years of hunting Ghost, she had never heard him speak. Intelligence reports suggested he was American, probably military background, possibly special operations. But hearing his actual voice, calm, professional, carrying the kind of steady authority that marked natural leaders, was somehow more unsettling than all his anonymous sabotage. Surrender, she asked, moving toward the sound while staying alert for flanking attacks. Cooperation. The station is failing faster than either of us anticipated. We've got maybe 20 minutes before structural collapse makes reaching the escape pod impossible. Lyra's tactical display confirmed his assessment. The damage from their running battle had accelerated the station's deterioration. What had been a dying facility was now an active collapse. And you propose what, exactly? Temporary ceasefire. We both want to survive this, and we both need that escape pod. Let's get there alive and settle our differences afterward. After 3 years of hunting you, you expect me to trust your word? I expect you to trust your own tactical assessment, Ghost replied. How many of your soldiers have I killed in direct combat versus how many I've eliminated through sabotage and misdirection? Lyra considered the question. Ghost's reputation was built on spectacular destructions, ships, stations, installations destroyed with surgical precision. But when she actually analyzed the casualty reports, most of his attacks had been designed to disable rather than massacre. You avoid unnecessary killing, she realized. Professional soldiers deserve professional respect. I fight the hegemony, not individual warriors. Yet you've killed thousands of my people. Your people have killed millions of mine, Ghost pointed out matter-of-factly. War isn't about fairness. But it doesn't have to be about cruelty either. Lyra found herself in the unprecedented position of having a philosophical conversation with her greatest enemy while a space station collapsed around them. It was surreal enough to be almost amusing. What do you propose? We work together to reach the escape pod. Once we're both safely aboard, we resume hostilities according to whatever rules of engagement you prefer. And if I refuse? Then we both die here, and the war continues without either of us. Your choice, Commander. Lyra checked her chrono. 28 minutes until life support failure. Probably less than 15 before the route to the escape pod became impassable. Ghost was right about the tactical reality. But trusting her enemy went against every instinct she developed in 3 years of pursuit. Time's running short, Ghost added. What's it going to be? Commander Lyra Cathfar, elite hunter of the hegemony's most wanted terrorist, faced the most difficult choice of her military career. Work with her enemy to survive, or maintain her principles and die with honor. The station shuddered around them, metal screaming as gravity and vacuum fought for control. Time to decide. Terms, Lyra said finally, her weapons still trained on Ghost's last known position. Simple. Neither of us shoots, stabs, or explodes the other until we're both safely in the escape pod. After that, we settle things however you prefer. You're assuming the pod has life support for 2. It's a standard emergency pod. Designed for a crew of 4. We'll have atmosphere, but the ride back to civilization will be cozy. Lyra's tactical display showed 16 minutes until the route to Pod Bay 12 became impassable. 14 minutes until the bay itself was likely to be compromised by structural collapse. Show yourself, she demanded. No stealth, no tricks. If we're doing this, I want to see what I'm working with. There was a pause, then a shimmer in the air as Ghost's camouflage system deactivated completely. He stepped out from behind a massive piece of mining equipment, his hands raised but not empty. He still held his weapons, finger nowhere near the triggers, and a gesture of limited trust. Lyra got her first clear look at the human who had haunted her for 3 years. He was older than she'd expected, probably in his 40s by human standards. Graying hair, weathered features, scars that spoke of years in combat zones. His equipment was indeed improvised, military gear modified with salvaged alien technology, held together with what appeared to be determination and technical skill. What surprised her most were his eyes. She'd expected fanaticism, hatred, the kind of burning intensity that drove terrorists to their extremes. Instead, she saw the calm professionalism of a career soldier who had simply found himself on the wrong side of an impossible situation. You're not what I expected, she admitted. Neither are you. Ghost's gaze took in her scarred armor, the way she held her weapons with practiced competence. Intelligence reports suggested you were a political appointee playing at being a soldier. Intelligence reports are often wrong. Clearly. They studied each other across the mechanical maze, 2 professionals taking each other's measure while the station died around them. Lyra found herself noting tactical details. Ghost's stance suggested special operations training, his equipment placement spoke of someone who had learned to fight outnumbered and outgunned, his body language carried the controlled readiness of someone who had survived too many battles to count. 13 minutes, Ghost said, checking a chronometer that looked human in design. We need to move. Lead the way. I'll cover our 6. You're willing to put me in front where I could ambush you? You're willing to put me behind you where I could shoot you in the back, Lyra pointed out. Professional courtesy works both ways. Ghost actually smiled at that, a brief expression that transformed his weather-beaten features into something almost friendly. Fair enough. Try to keep up. He began moving through the machinery with economical efficiency, choosing routes that provided cover while maintaining progress toward Pod Bay 12. Lyra followed, noting how Ghost moved like someone who understood that speed and stealth were often more valuable than firepower. How long have you been fighting? She asked as they navigated around a particularly large piece of equipment. Since the hegemony arrived at Earth. 6 years, 8 months, 13 days. Personal? Isn't it always? Ghost paused at an intersection, checking for structural stability before proceeding. My daughter was at the Orbital Academy when your fleet arrived. She was 8 years old. Lyra felt something cold settle in her stomach. The Academy was declared a military target due to its training programs. The Academy was a school for children, Ghost replied without heat. Your fleet commander made a strategic decision to eliminate future resistance by destroying educational infrastructure. That's not, Lyra began, then stopped. She'd read the after-action reports from Earth's conquest. Targets had indeed included schools, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure deemed to have military potential. Standard doctrine, she said quietly. Yes. It was. Ghost's voice carried no accusation, just tired acceptance. Your people fight wars by eliminating entire civilizations. Mine fight wars by killing specific enemies. Different philosophies. They continued through the failing station, and Lyra found herself thinking about the difference Ghost had identified. Hegemony military doctrine was indeed based on total warfare, the complete elimination of an enemy's capacity to resist through the destruction of their entire support structure. It was efficient. It was thorough. It was also, she was beginning to realize, exactly the kind of strategy that would turn someone like Ghost into an implacable enemy. 10 minutes, Ghost announced, leading them into a corridor that showed significant structural damage. This is going to be tricky. The passage ahead was partially collapsed, with only a narrow gap between fallen support beams and buckled deck plating. They would have to crawl through single file, completely vulnerable to attack from either direction. After you, Lyra said. After you, Ghost replied. They looked at each other for a moment, then both smiled grimly at the absurdity of the situation. Together, Lyra decided. Side by side. That way we're equally vulnerable. Works for me. They squeezed through the gap together, weapons holstered for safety, each hyper-aware of how easy it would be for the other to commit violence in the confined space. But the moment passed without incident, and they emerged into a section of corridor that was intact but showing stress fractures that suggested imminent failure. 8 minutes, Ghost said, breaking into a steady jog. The base should be just ahead. Should be? The structural damage may have altered the internal layout. We might need to improvise. They reached Pod Bay 12 to find that Ghost's caution had been justified. The bay itself was intact, and the escape pod appeared functional, but the entire chamber had shifted 15 degrees due to structural failure. What had been a simple boarding procedure was now a complex climbing exercise. Can you make that climb in your armor? Ghost asked, studying the angles. Can you make it carrying whatever gear you'll need to restart hostilities once we're aboard? Good point. Ghost began shedding unnecessary equipment, keeping only essential weapons and survival gear. 6 minutes. Let's move. They climbed together toward the escape pod, helping each other navigate the shifted geometry while the station groaned and shuddered around them. Lyra found herself impressed by Ghost's physical conditioning. He moved with the easy strength of someone who had spent years in zero-gravity combat situations. 5 minutes, she called out as they reached the pod's entry hatch. Which one of us goes first? Ghost asked. It was a moment of perfect tactical vulnerability. Whoever entered the pod first would be completely at the mercy of the other for several crucial seconds. Lyra looked at Ghost, this human who had been her enemy and obsession for 3 years, who had killed her soldiers and haunted her dreams, who had also just spent 15 minutes helping her survive. Together, she said again. Professional courtesy. They entered the escape pod side by side, and Ghost immediately began the launch sequence while Lyra secured their gear and activated life support systems. 3 minutes to spare, Ghost said as the pod ejected from the dying station. Not bad timing. Through the pod's small viewport, they watched the mining station tear itself apart in a slowly expanding cloud of debris and escaping atmosphere. We made it, Lyra said, somewhat surprised to be alive. Yes, we did. Ghost turned to face her, his expression becoming serious again. Which brings us to the question of what happens next. They were alone in a small escape pod, armed enemies with nowhere to run, floating in empty space with several days of travel time ahead of them. Lyra checked her weapons and saw Ghost doing the same. What happens next, she said quietly, is that we finish what we started. The temporary ceasefire was over. The real battle was about to begin. Before we try to kill each other in a confined space, Ghost said, settling into the pilot's seat, we should probably figure out where we're going. Lyra studied the pod's navigation display, noting their position relative to known stellar bodies and shipping lanes. The nearest hegemony outpost is Kepler Station, bearing 047 Mark 18. Approximately 6 days at this pod's maximum velocity. And the nearest human settlement? New Geneva Colony, bearing 182 Mark 9. 7 days, assuming their defense grid doesn't shoot us down on approach. Ghost was quiet for a moment, running calculations on the pod's limited computer systems. We have life support for 2 people for approximately 10 days. Food and water for maybe 8. Realistically, we need to pick one destination and hope we reach it before our supplies run out. Or, Lyra said carefully, we could reduce our life support requirements by 50%. By killing each other. Yes, I'd consider that option. Ghost's voice was matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing routine maintenance procedures. Of course, if the survivor gets picked up by the wrong side, they're likely to face interrogation, imprisonment, or execution. An excellent point. Lyra found herself in the surreal position of discussing murder logistics with her intended victim. Either destination presents significant risks for either of us. So we're back to cooperation. Temporary cooperation. Until we reach safety. And then we resume our war. Ghost nodded as if this made perfect sense. Fair enough. In the meantime, we need to decide on a destination. Your vote? Lyra studied the tactical display, considering their options. A hegemony station would mean safety for her and death or worse for Ghost. A human colony would likely mean the reverse. Neutral space, she said finally. The Arcturus Trading Post. It's owned by the Merchant Guild, and they maintain strict neutrality in the war. That's 12 days away. Yes. Which means we'll be cutting our life support very close, but neither of us will have to surrender to the enemy. Unless one of us doesn't survive the journey. Unless that, yes. Ghost programmed the course change into the pod's navigation system. Arcturus it is. 12 days of trying not to murder each other in a space roughly the size of a storage closet. Should be interesting. As the pod settled into its new heading, Lyra and Ghost established what they diplomatically called protocols for coexistence. Weapon storage, secured but accessible, sleep schedules, alternating watches, food rationing, mathematically precise, and the boundaries of their temporary truce, no violence, no sabotage, no attempts to alter course without mutual agreement. You're remarkably civilized for a terrorist, Lyra observed during their second day of travel. You're remarkably reasonable for an occupying force, Ghost replied, working on what appeared to be routine maintenance of his equipment. They had fallen into an oddly comfortable routine. Ghost proved to be an excellent navigator and engineer, keeping the pod running smoothly despite its age and the stress of their escape. Lyra contributed her tactical knowledge and sensor expertise, helping them avoid patrol routes that might lead to awkward encounters with either military force. Can I ask you something? Lyra said during the third day. Shoot. Your tactics. The way you've been fighting this war. You could have caused much more destruction, killed many more of my people. Why haven't you? Ghost was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the component he was repairing. Because the moment I start thinking of your people as things instead of people, I become the monster I'm fighting against. He resumed his work with steady precision. Your soldiers are following orders, serving their government, trying to survive just like mine are. The fact that we're on different sides doesn't make them evil. Even though we invaded your worlds? Even though you're following orders from leaders who make strategic decisions that result in dead children. Ghost's voice carried no heat, just tired acceptance. I fight the system, not the individuals trapped in it. That's a dangerous philosophy for a soldier. All good philosophies are dangerous. That's what makes them worth having. During the fourth day, Lyra found herself sharing her own perspective on the war, trying to explain the hegemony's position to someone who had spent years fighting against it. From our perspective, we're bringing stability to chaotic regions. Human space was fractured, divided, constantly fighting internal conflicts. The hegemony offers unity, purpose, collective strength. At the cost of individual freedom. Freedom to make the kinds of mistakes that lead to self-destruction. How many human colonies were failing before we arrived? How many were involved in pointless wars with their neighbors? Some of them, yes. But that was their choice to make. Even if it was the wrong choice? Especially if it was the wrong choice. The right to fail is part of what makes success meaningful. By the sixth day, they were debating philosophy, ethics, and military theory with the passion of academy students rather than sworn enemies. Lyra found herself genuinely enjoying the intellectual challenge of defending her position against someone who understood the subject matter from a completely different perspective. "You're not what I expected from human intelligence reports," she said during a pause in their discussion of asymmetric warfare theory. "What did they say about me?" "Fanatic. Unstable. Driven by hatred and revenge to commit increasingly desperate acts of terrorism." Lyra studied Ghost's competent handling of the pod's systems. They got that completely wrong. Intelligence analysis often reflects the assumptions of the analysts, Ghost observed. It's easier to dismiss your enemy as irrational than to acknowledge that they might have legitimate grievances. Do you have legitimate grievances? My daughter was 8 years old when your fleet bombed her school. You tell me. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight that had nothing to do with military tactics or political philosophy. Lyra felt something twist in her chest as she processed the personal cost of strategic decisions she had never questioned. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm sorry that happened to your family." "Thank you. That means something, coming from you." "Does it change anything? Between us personally?" "Yes." "Between what we represent?" "No." Ghost's expression was sad but resolute. "When we reach Arcturus, we'll go our separate ways and probably never see each other again. But we'll both return to our respective sides of this war. And continue fighting." By the 8th day, their conversations had shifted from philosophical debates to personal stories. Ghost talked about his life before the war, an engineer who had specialized in orbital construction projects, a father who had coached his daughter's zero-gravity football team, a man who had never expected to become a soldier. Lyra shared her own background, a career military officer from a family with 12 generations of service, someone who had been trained from childhood to serve the hegemony's expansion, a commander who had never questioned the rightness of her cause until she found herself talking to someone who represented everything she'd been taught to oppose. "What will you do after the war?" she asked during the 10th day, as their supplies reached critically low levels. "Assuming I survive it. Go home. Help rebuild what's left. Try to become someone my daughter would have been proud of." Ghost checked their position on the navigation display. "You? I don't know. For 3 years, hunting you has been my primary purpose. When that's finished." She trailed off, realizing she had never considered what came after revenge. Maybe find a new purpose. Something that builds instead of destroys. Maybe. On the 12th day, as their life support reached the final hours of functionality, the Arcturus trading post appeared on their sensors like a beacon of civilization in the void. "We made it," Ghost said with evident relief. "Yes, we did." Lyra activated the pod's emergency beacon, signaling for assistance. Together. As rescue ships approached from the trading post, Lyra and Ghost began the process of securing their weapons and preparing for separation. In a few hours, they would be processed by neutral authorities, debriefed, and released to return to their respective sites. "It's been educational," Lyra said as they prepared for docking. "Likewise." Ghost offered his hand in the human gesture of farewell. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're the one who's been hunting me. Someone with less honor might have made this war much uglier. Lyra clasped his hand, noting the strength and calluses that spoke of years of manual labor and combat. For what it's worth, she replied, I understand now why my people have never been able to stop you. You're fighting for something you believe in, not just against something you hate. Is there a difference? All the difference in the universe. As the trading post's docking systems engaged in their journey together came to an end, both warriors faced the reality of returning to a war that neither of them had started but both were committed to finishing. The silence between them held the weight of 12 days' worth of understanding, respect, and the knowledge that the next time they met, they would once again be enemies. But for 12 days, they had been something else entirely. The debriefing rooms at Arcturus Trading Post were designed for privacy and neutrality, sterile, comfortable spaces where representatives of warring factions could be processed without fear of compromise or espionage. Lyra sat across from Administrator Chen, a middle-aged human woman who represented the Merchant Guild's interests in maintaining the trading post's non-aligned status. The administrator's questions had been routine so far: identity verification, destination preferences, medical needs, but Lyra could sense they were building towards something more significant. Commander Kethvar, Administrator Chen said, consulting her data pad, we've been contacted by representatives from both the Hegemony and the Earth Defense Force regarding your situation. What kind of contact? Your government has offered substantial payment for your immediate repatriation. They seem quite anxious to debrief you regarding your extended contact with the human operative known as Ghost. Lyra had expected this. Spending 12 days in close quarters with one of humanity's most wanted terrorists would naturally raise questions about intelligence compromise, psychological manipulation, and the possibility of defection. And the human contact? More interesting. The Earth Defense Force has made an unusual request. Administrator Chen's expression suggested she found the request both surprising and significant. They've asked for permission to negotiate directly with you. Negotiate what? They didn't specify. But they've offered considerable trade concessions to the Merchant Guild in exchange for facilitating a meeting. Lyra considered this development. In her experience, humans didn't negotiate with individual hegemony officers unless they had something very specific in mind. Have they indicated what they want to discuss? No. But I suspect it has something to do with your traveling companion. Administrator Chen leaned forward slightly. Commander, in 30 years of running this facility, I've never seen two enemy combatants arrive together and request separate processing. What exactly happened out there? We survived, Lyra said simply. Together. And now? Now I return to my duties, and he returns to his. Administrator Chen studied Lyra's expression with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading the motivations of beings from dozens of species. Commander, I'm going to share something with you that you might find interesting. The human operative you know as Ghost has declined immediate repatriation to human space. Lyra felt surprise flicker through her. He's not returning to Earth? He's requested asylum as a non-combatant refugee. He wants to remain here at Arcturus, working as a technical consultant for the Merchant Guild. That's... Lyra struggled to process this information. That's not possible. Ghost is one of Earth's most effective operatives. They wouldn't let him retire. According to our records, he's not retiring. He's deserting. The word hit Lyra like a physical blow. Desertion was the one unforgivable sin in military culture, regardless of species. No matter how justified the cause, no matter how compelling the circumstances, abandoning your post was the ultimate betrayal of everything a soldier represented. Why? He hasn't said. But I suspect it has something to do with his 12-day conversation with a certain hegemony commander. Administrator Chen activated a holographic display showing the trading post's residential sections. He's in quarters 247 if you'd like to ask him directly. The human delegation isn't arriving for another 6 hours. You have time. Lyra stared at the display, trying to understand what Ghost's decision meant. After 3 years of hunting him, after 12 days of philosophical debate and growing respect, he was simply stopping. Walking away from the war. Why are you telling me this? Because in 30 years of facilitating negotiations between hostile parties, I've learned to recognize when something significant is happening. Administrator Chen's expression was quietly knowing. Whatever you two discussed during your journey, it was important enough to make a career soldier question everything he's been fighting for. That suggests it might be worth exploring further. 20 minutes later, Lyra stood outside quarters 247, trying to decide whether to activate the door chime. She had no idea what she wanted to say to Ghost, no clear sense of why she felt compelled to see him. She activated the chime. "Come in," Ghost's voice called from inside. The quarters were standard merchant guild accommodation, functional, comfortable, utterly anonymous. Ghost sat at a small desk, working on what appeared to be technical specifications for some kind of engineering project. "Commander," he said without looking up. "I wondered if you'd come by. I heard about your decision." "Ah." Ghost saved his work and turned to face her. "What do you think of it?" "I think you're making a mistake. Your people need you." "Do they? Or do they need someone willing to keep killing hegemony soldiers indefinitely?" Lyra studied his expression, noting the exhaustion that hadn't been visible during their escape. "You're tired." "I'm done." Ghost gestured to the technical specifications on his desk. 6 years of fighting, hundreds of operations, thousands of enemy casualties. And for what? The war continues exactly as it did before I started. The only thing I've accomplished is adding my name to the list of people who've lost their souls to this conflict. You saved lives. You protected human colonies. I killed people, Lyra. Good people who were following orders, serving their governments, trying to do their duty. Ghost's use of her first name surprised her. They had maintained formal address throughout their journey. Including people I came to respect. You can't stop fighting just because you've learned to see the enemy as people. Can I? What's the point of fighting if you lose your humanity in the process? Lyra found herself without an answer. The question cut to the heart of everything they had discussed during their 12 days together: the cost of war, the price of duty, the difference between serving a cause and serving your conscience. "The human delegation is coming to recruit you back," she said. "They'll offer you anything you want: rank, resources, freedom to conduct operations however you see fit." "I know. That's why I'm leaving before they arrive." "Leaving?" "The Merchant Guild has offered me a position with their engineering corps. Civilian work, non-military projects, a chance to build things instead of destroying them." Ghost stood and moved to the window, looking out at the trading post's bustling commercial district. "It's not much, but it's something. And if the war comes here? If Arcturus is forced to choose sides? Then I'll face that decision when it happens. But I won't spend the rest of my life preparing for it." Lyra joined him at the window, watching beings from dozens of species conducting business with the kind of casual cooperation that was impossible in the war zones they had both known. "My government expects me to return with intelligence about human resistance capabilities," she said quietly. "They expect a full debrief about everything we discussed, every weakness you revealed, every tactical insight I gained." "And will you give them what they expect?" "I don't know." The admission surprised her as much as it surprised Ghost. 3 weeks ago, the answer would have been obvious. But now? Now you've spent 12 days talking to the enemy and discovered he's not a monster. Now I've spent 12 days talking to someone who made me question assumptions I never knew I was making. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the peaceful chaos of interspecies commerce that surrounded them. Finally, Ghost spoke. "What are you going to do?" "Return to my duties. Report for reassignment. Continue serving the hegemony as I've been trained to do." Lyra's voice carried no enthusiasm for these prospects. "What else can I do?" "You could stay." The words hung between them like an offered gift and a dangerous temptation. Lyra felt the weight of 3 years hunting Ghost, 12 days learning to respect him, and the sudden possibility of walking away from everything that had defined her life. Desertion. Freedom. From responsibility. From a war that's turning good people into killers and killers into heroes. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of Ghost's suggestion. To abandon her post, her people, her sworn duties. To choose personal conscience over military honor. I can't, she said finally. My people need soldiers who remember that the enemy are people too. If everyone like us walks away, who's left to fight with honor? And if everyone with honor keeps fighting, who's left to stop the war? It was a question without an easy answer, perhaps without any answer at all. The transport to hegemony space leaves in 4 hours, Lyra said. The engineering transport to the outer rim leaves in 3. They both understood what was being offered and what was being declined. I hope you find what you're looking for, Lyra said. I hope you find a way to serve your conscience and your duty both. And if our paths cross again? Ghost considered this. If you're still hunting people like me, and I'm still running from people like you, then I suppose we'll have to see who we've become. Lyra nodded, understanding that this was as close to a goodbye as two warriors could manage. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Ghost, what's your real name? Marcus. Marcus Chen. He smiled sadly. What's yours? Lyra. Just Lyra. It's been an honor, Lyra. Likewise, Marcus. She left him standing at the window, looking out at a universe where peace was possible, if only in small spaces between the wars that defined their lives. 3 hours later, Lyra was aboard a hegemony transport heading back to her duties, carrying with her the memory of 12 days when enemies became people and people became something approaching friends. 2 hours after that, Marcus was aboard a civilian transport heading toward the outer rim, carrying with him the hope that somewhere in the galaxy, there were still places where building was more important than destroying. Neither of them knew whether they would ever see each other again. Both of them knew they had been fundamentally changed by the silence that had been shattered not by violence, but by the choice to see humanity in the enemy. 6 months later, the war found them both again. Lyra stood on the bridge of the hegemony cruiser Vigilant Dawn, watching tactical displays that showed the systematic destruction of everything she had come to understand about honor and warfare. The target was New Ceres, a human agricultural colony with minimal military value but significant symbolic importance. Orbital bombardment will commence in 30 minutes, Admiral Thekran announced to the assembled fleet commanders. Total sterilization protocol. No survivors. Around the briefing room, other commanders nodded with the mechanical precision of officers who had stopped thinking of strategic targets as places where people lived. Lyra had once been among them, accepting such orders as necessary components of warfare. Now, she found herself thinking about Marcus Chen's 8-year-old daughter. Admiral, she said, her voice cutting through the routine acknowledgments, I request clarification of our strategic objectives. The briefing room fell silent. Thekran's 4 eyes focused on Lyra with the kind of attention that suggested her question was unexpected and unwelcome. Clarification, Commander. New Ceres has no military installations, no strategic manufacturing, no fleet support capabilities. What strategic value does its destruction serve? The strategic value of demonstrating the cost of resistance, Admiral Thekran replied with practiced authority. Human morale will be significantly impacted by the loss of one of their oldest agricultural colonies. As will human desperation. Colonies that surrender become productive assets. Colonies that resist to the death because they expect no mercy become resource sinks that cost us ships and personnel. The other commanders were staring at Lyra with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. She was articulating doubts that professional soldiers weren't supposed to voice. Commander Kethvar, Admiral Thekran said carefully, your psychological evaluation following your extended contact with human prisoners has been reviewed. If you require additional treatment for contamination effects. I require clarity about our strategic goals, Lyra interrupted. Are we conquering human space or simply destroying it? We are establishing the dominance necessary for lasting peace. By ensuring that every human in the galaxy has personal reasons to hate us. Lyra activated her personal tactical display, showing casualty projections. New series has a population of 40,000. Orbital bombardment will eliminate a population that could have been a productive component of the post-war economy. Instead, we create 40,000 martyrs and guarantee that their families throughout human space will never accept hegemony rule. Your concerns are noted, Commander. Bombardment proceeds as scheduled. Lyra felt something fundamental crystallize in her mind, the same clarity that Marcus had described when he spoke about becoming someone his daughter would have been proud of. Then I respectfully request transfer to non-combat duties. The silence that followed was absolute. Admiral Thekran stared at Lyra as if she had announced her intention to sprout wings and fly home under her own power. Transfer? I am no longer willing to participate in operations that serve no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating our capacity for cruelty. Commander, you are dangerously close to insubordination. No, sir. I am dangerously close to remembering what we're supposed to be fighting for. Admiral Thekran studied Lyra with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex tactical problem. Finally, he gestured to the security officers posted around the briefing room. Commander Kethvar will be confined to quarters pending psychological evaluation. Her concerns about operational parameters will be addressed through appropriate channels. As security officers moved to escort her from the bridge, Lyra felt a strange sense of relief. For 6 months, she had tried to serve her conscience and her duty simultaneously. Now, finally, she understood that the two had become incompatible. Admiral, she said as the security officers reached her position, when you're writing your after-action report, please note that 40,000 people are about to die because we're afraid to look weak. Noted, Commander. As they led her away, Lyra caught sight of the tactical display showing new series, a small blue-green world where families were living their lives, completely unaware that their government's resistance had marked them for extinction. She thought about Marcus Chen, wherever he was, and wondered if he had found the peace he was looking for. 3 hours later and 12 parsecs away, Marcus stood in the engineering bay of the merchant vessel Star's Promise, watching news feeds from the new series system with the cold rage of someone who had walked away from war only to see it follow him anyway. 40,000 confirmed dead, reported Captain Sarah Wong, the ship's commander and Marcus's current employer. Total planetary sterilization. Nothing left alive larger than bacteria. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every life he hadn't saved, every operation he wasn't conducting, every difference he wasn't making because he had chosen personal peace over professional duty. Sir, came a voice from the communication station. We're receiving a priority transmission on emergency frequencies. Source appears to be a hegemony military vessel. Put it through. The main display activated to show a familiar face, Lyra Kethvar, though she looked different now. Older, sadder, wearing civilian clothes instead of military uniform. Marcus, she said, her image flickering through the static of long-range transmission. I hope this message finds you well. Around the engineering bay, Marcus's colleagues were staring at the display with expressions of shock and alarm. A hegemony officer contacting their ship was the kind of development that usually preceded very unfortunate events. I wanted you to know that I tried, Lyra continued. I tried to serve my conscience and my duty both, as you suggested. But today I learned that the two have become mutually exclusive. Marcus felt understanding settle in his mind like pieces of a complex equation finally resolving. I've been relieved of command and am currently facing court-martial for refusing to participate in what my government calls strategic demonstration operations. Lyra's smile was sad but genuine. I thought you might appreciate the irony. Sir, Captain Wong said quietly, we need to consider the security implications. Wait, Marcus said, not taking his eyes off the display. I'm transmitting the location of a hegemony prison transport that will be traveling through neutral space in 72 hours, Lyra continued. It carries political prisoners, including several human resistance leaders who have information your people might find valuable. The display flickered with incoming data, ship specifications, route projections, security protocols. I'm also transmitting my personal credentials and a formal request for asylum with the Merchant Guild. I believe it's time for me to explore civilian opportunities. Marcus stared at the display, understanding what Lyra was offering and what she was asking for. This is my choice, Marcus. The same choice you made 6 months ago. I hope your engineering corps has room for someone with tactical planning experience. The transmission ended, leaving Marcus to process what had just happened. Lyra had chosen conscience over duty, just as he had. She was defecting, providing intelligence to her former enemies, abandoning everything she had been trained to serve. Sir, Captain Wong said urgently, we need to decide how to respond to this. That intelligence could save lives, but accepting it makes us part of whatever this is. Marcus studied the tactical data Lyra had provided. The prison transport was heavily armed but predictably routed. A rescue operation would be dangerous but entirely feasible with the right planning and execution. Captain, he said finally, how do you feel about conducting a humanitarian rescue operation? Humanitarian? Those prisoners aren't just intelligence assets. They're people whose only crime was refusing to surrender to an occupying force. Marcus began analyzing the transport security systems with the professional interest of someone who had spent years planning similar operations. Besides, someone just handed us the opportunity to save lives instead of taking them. And the hegemony officer will be transferred to Arcturus Trading Post, where she can apply for asylum through proper channels. Marcus smiled for the first time in months. Assuming she survives the rescue operation. You're planning to take her with us? I'm planning to give her the same choice she gave me 6 months ago. Marcus activated the ship's communication system, preparing to contact other vessels in the merchant convoy. The choice to fight for something worth building instead of against something worth destroying. As the star's promise changed course toward the coordinates Lyra had provided, Marcus found himself returning to active operations for the first time since his desertion. But this time, he wasn't fighting for Earth or against the hegemony. He was fighting for the idea that enemies could become allies, that warriors could become builders, and that sometimes the most important battle was the one you fought against your own assumptions. 72 hours later, a hegemony prison transport would suffer a complete systems failure in neutral space, its prisoners rescued by unknown parties and its cargo manifest mysteriously altered. And somewhere in the aftermath, 2 former enemies would begin the difficult work of proving that the silence of war could be shattered not by violence, but by the choice to see possibility in the most impossible circumstances. The war would continue. But it would continue without them, leaving them free to build something that neither of their governments had ever imagined possible, a peace that started with 2 people who chose to trust each other despite every reason not to. In a galaxy torn apart by conflict, that was a victory worth more than any battle they had ever won in uniform. The silence had been shattered. What grew from the pieces would be their choice to make.